MyKnowledgeMap, with a company who make Myprogress, we were actually started in 2000. And in 2006, we got involved in a project called ALPS, which was a partnership of 5 Yorkshire universities looking at assessment in practice settings. So it's had quite a... We were actually the kind of commercial partner for that project. We've been working on this sort of thing for about 10 years. That original ALPS programme involved, I think it was 16 healthcare professions. And so nurses have been involved from the very start. But what happened after ALPS was that the University of Leeds School of Medicine really wanted to take this forward. The original ALPS programme, we were working on these very bulky, slow, old devices. The iPhone had barely even come out. When Leeds decided that they wanted to take it forward after ALPS, they were actually planning on providing an iPhone for each of their students. So we started to create this product for practice-based assessment for iPhones, originally for medical students. And from there, we've been developing the product. We had our initial product release in about 2010, but it didn't really take off as a kind of general purpose product until we had an Android app as well as an iOS app, and that meant that people could run bring your own device products. People without the budget that you'd need to buy iPads or iPhones for all of your students could start to use the system. So in 2013, really, that's where it sort of took off, and we've had 6 releases now. Each one has introduced more and more functionality. I'll say a little bit about the process by which we decide what goes into a release, but it's all by talking to our customers. So obviously, with it being medical schools using it early on, a lot of those enhancements were based around the needs of medical schools, which are a little bit different when it comes to assessment in practice settings. It tends to be more kind of real time. There isn't that kind of strong bond with mentors. And then when Anglia Ruskin, who were our first big nursing implementation, and a number of other nursing schools came on board, we've been building in more and more functionality that really makes it a good fit for those sorts of courses. So in terms of what we've got so far, we've got a platform for e-practice assessment offline in healthcare settings, and that's really our focus. It's the app, the fact that students can use it offline, because with the best will in the world, even if you've got a good connection, the idea of kind of interrupting that clinical scenario to log into a system really does start to make things quite cumbersome for capturing evidence in the heat of the moment and so on. From the point of view of a nursing course, really it's about a practice assessment document on a tablet for all of your students. So about moving from the paper-based systems, the pads, the heavy paper pack that you're carrying around with you, to something that you can carry around on a tablet. And with that, there come a number of efficiencies, as well as moving away from paper and not having to do all that photocopying and admin. You can start to do things like using the multimedia capabilities of the device and involving different stakeholders in the process in a much nicer way than you might be able to do with paper. We've got tools and workflows for mentors to interact with the practice assessment document, and we started to go into some of those this morning. So I've just got a little kind of animation here which shows a course administrator creates an assessment form. So this will be setting up all of those forms that are in the pad. When you come on board with Myprogress, you can start with a completely blank slate and create everything, all of the materials that you're using yourself, and there's those authoring tools that you saw this morning that allow you to build those up. And then you can choose how you push that form out. In this particular workflow example, we're going to look at pushing it out to a student or a cohort of students. When the student has an internet connection, that form or the set of forms which make up the practice assessment document are pulled down onto their mobile device. It's available to use offline, and then when they're out in practice, they identify an opportunity to fill out one of those forms or have a mentor sign them off on something. They just hand the device over to a mentor who fills out the form, hands it back to the student. That's then locked. The student can't make any changes to that. The next time the student has an internet connection, the form syncs back to Myprogress, And the response is now available for faculty to review, it's available for mentors to review, and the mentor optionally receives this security message. You may be setting things up so that mentors actually have direct system access, which is another way of doing it, or you can do both. So they get this security message, which is an email saying you assess such and such on this day. If you don't think that's correct, then contact the administrator. So that's one of the workflows. There are other ways of doing it. For example, the course administrator could push the forms directly out to the mentor. They would then be able to sync the pad for all of their students along with a list of names. And when they're working with a student, they'd be able to pick the student from the list, complete the assessment, and then sync back to Myprogress. And then the response is available to review, and the student also gets a copy of that on their device. So the student's still getting the full output for the pad. So just a couple of examples. As time's gone on, we've built kind of richer workflows that cover some particular kind of cases that you might be interested in. So there's things like workflows that are really optimized for 360-degree assessments or multi-source feedback types of assessments. There are workflows that are optimized for just students doing their own reflections. So there's all sorts of flexibility in that, and it's very easy to switch from one way of doing it to another. At some institutions, they have people in clinical skills suites who want to use their own tablet when assessing students, but when you've got students out in practice, it's better to do it on the student's device. So it's very flexible. And then there are tools for logging time and activities spent in placement, for getting timesheets signed off. I won't dwell on that, but you set up the activities that you want to track time against, and then the timesheets are available on the device. There's tools, as we saw in Sean's demonstration, that allow faculty to view, review, report on the practice assessment documents and student progress. And there are tools for administrators to create the materials from scratch, and everything's customizable. This is the version of the authoring tool that you saw this morning was actually the version 5, which has a smaller number of questions. In version 6, we've introduced some interesting new questions as well as the kind of multiple choice and some of those kind of standard form building ones. We've got things like a group picker or a placement picker. So you might have one standard form that the student's completing in lots of different parts of their second year or whatever it might be, but you want to track which particular clinical environments or which particular placements those forms were actually logged or completed on. You can just build that into your form and it'll pull down information from the system about which groups they potentially could be a member of, so you get a nice dynamic list that's formatted by the system. As Steve said, we've got things like a new signature question type, which just puts a box in there for the signature. We have found that there's some resistance to this email-based way of working, which I'll say a little bit more about later. And so this just allows you to work like signing for a parcel. You know, someone scribbles something with their finger. It's maybe doesn't give you as good an audit trail as the email stuff, but in terms of that kind of feeling of the traditional sign-off of something, it's quite nice for making people think that this is serious. I've signed this off, and a student might think twice about if they were up to no good about filling one of those out fraudulently. So that's really what we've done so far. Our next release, Myprogress 6.2, really the focus is on expanding some of the areas where it's maybe a little bit difficult at the moment for students to keep track of what they've done, where they're up to, and that kind of thing. So what we've done is we've gone and talked to people. We had a version 6 release fairly recently where the focus was on stability and a number of new features. There's actually stuff that we developed for that release that we held back on just because we really did want the whole theme of that release was about making the platform more stable. So we didn't want to give people loads and loads of functionality on top of that. So we've got stuff that we've actually developed, that we're doing testing on, that we're further refining, that we're starting to show to some of our existing customers. And some of the feedback that we've had, particularly from the administrators, is that Myprogress is great. It's easier than paper when it comes to distributing stuff to students, getting things back, getting them back out to the students if you need to review them. But deploying assessments is still a real significant admin overhead because the model has come from medical schools where you might be pushing a few forms out once at the beginning of the year, and then they work with a small number of forms. They're just logging some directly observed procedural skills, some mini CX, just a few standard forms, rather than having this structured portfolio type approach where you've got maybe 80 or 90 forms we've seen in some institutions. So for an administrator, the way it works at the moment is they have to deploy each one of those individually, which is obviously not ideal. So what we're doing in version 6.2, we're doing two approaches. One is a simple approach where you can just put a bunch of forms into a category. So you can say all of these forms relate to, it could be year 2, or it could be something like a particular specialism. And then you can just bulk deploy all of those in one go. And then we're doing something slightly more sophisticated as well, which again is maybe a bit more time consuming for administrators, but we think that in the future it will make their lives really easy, which is just the ability to set up your whole course in advance. So you say, in year 1, the students are going to need these forms at these particular times when they're members of these particular rotations. In year 2, they're going to need these forms. And then we already store information about when students become members of particular groups. So if you've got all of that data loaded in, then the system can just run itself. And when Joe Bloggs joins such and such a rotation, they'll automatically get all of the forms that go with that rotation deployed down to their device. The app will know to remove all of the older forms that they no longer need. You can set up rules about what happens to forms at the end of the rotation, because when we've talked to people about this, they've said, well, actually, some of our students might want to go back to log some more of those sorts of clinical encounters. So you can set up rules about what actually happens at the end of a time period with those forms. So we think that that should make administrators' lives a lot easier. We've been told that certain aspects of the system are very frustrating for the mentors. And their number one complaint in nursing is all of these emails that they get. So every time you sign something off, you get an email. We're doing a lot of work on this release just to rationalise all of that. So as an institution, you'll be able to set up some rules about how that works. And you'll be able to set it so that mentors can just receive an email digest at the end of the week or at the end of the month, telling them everything that they've done. You'll be able to set it up so that if mentors are logging in to the system rather than receiving those emails, they can just log in and quickly see a digest of all of the stuff that the system thinks that they've signed off, and they can just check against that it is what they've done. There are some other areas though where mentors have kind of struggled, and that's being interrupted partway through an assessment. At the moment, we've got some workflows based on drafts being saved on the student device, which are designed to make that a little bit easier. But then you've got those concerns about what happens if a mentor actually wants to take an assessment away because the student's underperforming and they want to ensure that they can make a point in private that they want to get logged without maybe having to have that difficult conversation or worry about whether a student actually syncs their device or reinstalls the app or whatever it might be. And then there's the fact of just being a very busy mentor, and you've got a lot of positive feedback that you'd like to give a student, but you get interrupted before you can do that, and it's the end of the day and it gets lost. So either the student or the mentor, as of version 6.2, will be able to initiate a new workflow whereby they can start filling out a form on the device, and then they can say, well, actually email me this form to complete it. And then it will work. We've got a lot of people who are familiar with how the NHS portfolio works, where you get the ticket in your email and you can go away and fill that out on the web. So it's really following that sort of workflow that should be familiar with people, but giving them the opportunity to initiate that. Because a lot of the feedback that we've had is that actually doing things there and then on the device is really valuable, because it means you're capturing feedback in the heat of the moment rather than when you're tired at the end of the day having to work your way through all of those tickets. So that's really what we're planning on doing to support mentors. We started off really by adding timesheets, as it was something that we were told would be really useful for nursing courses. They were having to keep track of it. Mentors needed to sign them off. So we kind of built that into the app, and people started using it and it worked okay. But we didn't have a huge volume of timesheets being signed off. And now that we have done, there are various things that people have come back to us and said, well, it would be nice if I didn't receive all of these emails every time I signed off a timesheet. It would be nice if we had these better reports. It would be nice if, from a student's perspective, we had better visibility of the kind of the totals and the targets and what's expected of us. So we're doing a bit of work really bringing together all of that feedback and doing an awful lot of little improvements to the way that the time tracking works. And the other big one really is that people are always asked the question, what happens to the students' data at the end of the course? And if they're asking that, the answer that we've given them up to now is that, well, we can store that for you and we can do it for as long as you need it. We can store it for up to 20 years if you need it, which is fine from a data management point of view and might be what the IT people want to hear. But if you're a student, that's not really of much interest or concern to you, because you actually want to take that away in a format that you can start to do stuff with it. We've actually created this MyShowcase.me, which is a really visual portfolio tool for taking stuff that you've done and presenting it in graphical ways to potential employers or as part of your continuing professional development. So what we're now doing is, because there's all this assessment data in Myprogress that would really benefit from being showcased in that way, we're integrating the two products. And Sian's going to give you a quick glimpse of what my showcase looks like. But a big part of the 6.2 release will be integration between the two systems. And it's a personal tool, so an institution doesn't have to set it up. An individual can go in, they can create their own My Showcase account, which is completely free for an individual account. And then they can say in Myprogress, well, I've got this My Showcase account, and they can actually link those together. So the ultimate goal is for that to be a personal service for taking stuff away, with some additional services that institutions can use in terms of tracking what happens to their students and so on, if the students opt into that. The other point that people do make to us is that, again, while there are all these benefits over paper, one of the things that's really nice about a paper practice assessment document is that you've got this table of contents that gives you a complete overview of what you need to do. You've got that sense of working your way through a book, which was one of the original criticisms of the Kindle in academia and with readers, was that, you know, you don't get this sense of achievement of moving through a paper book and of your bookmark moving further through. And I think that's even more true with something like a practice assessment document, where you see all these empty boxes being filled out and you get a sense of what you need to skip back to. So in version 6.2, we've got these new dashboards for students so that you can actually set up rules about what needs to be done. So at the moment, there's no real sense of what achievement is other than having got a certain score or completed a certain form. Whereas what we often find is that people need stuff setting up so that you can say, I need you to complete 2 of these, 3 of those, they need to be done in this way. And in 6.2, you'll actually be able to start tracking those rules and giving students graphical representations of those rules. And the nice thing about that is the dashboard will actually be available offline. So if a student goes into a new clinical area and they need to share what they've done so far with somebody who maybe doesn't have system access, then it gives them a simple graphical overview of, it could be competencies or whatever. And you can limit what's available on that screen and set up how you want it to be visualised. So the way that we're planning to release all this is over 3 releases, with the first being available in July. We can be very confident about that, as I say, because we've already done a lot of the development work. And for any institutions who are already customers, we can actually give you preview access to that in the coming weeks, whenever you've got some time to look at it. we'll be following that up with another release in August and then a further release in September. So really we're aware that with version 6 it took us a long time to actually get it out the door, and what we're trying to do now is bundle things up into smaller releases so that you can take what you want. And institutions will be able to choose which one they go for. It won't be you have to upgrade through all of these releases. You can just choose to wait. Just a quick example of the sorts of dashboards and rules that we're making available. It might be something like we want students to record 3 mentor placement interviews, 3 mentor placement reviews, or it could be something a little bit more complex, so something like we want students to log their participation in at least 40 deliveries, including 5 where the baby's in breach, or you can actually start to dig into the questions within the form and pull out information. You might be asking about case complexity or something like that, and you actually want students to do some assessments in their final year where they're working with more complex cases or where they're working unaided, whereas you might be using the same form where they're also getting support from other team members. So you'll be able to set up all of those rules, and then we've created these dashboards which allow you to report back against those rules. Very visual. And there's dashboards for students, and those can be set up by the institution, saying these are the rules that we want to display. And you can also set up tutor and course lead dashboards, which give you an overview of how a whole group's doing against these sorts of rules. So you'll be able to access these new functions for testing soon if you're a customer, and we do want feedback. There's still time to feedback before the final release. I'm conscious of time. I'll just very quickly take you through what's coming post 6.2 and some of our vision for the future. We had a lot of feedback about how we need better support for skills logging, which gives this complete picture of progress through a course. At the moment, the forms are very much you fill out a form, you submit it, it's signed off, whatever it might be. A lot of nursing courses where they have clinical skills logging or something like that, that looks more like a competence framework that you're working with over a long period of time, where you're recording multiple assessments against these skills. You want to go back and see where the gaps are. Mentors need to go back and see where the gaps are so that they can get you working on the right kinds of cases. So we've actually already created a competency assessment extension, which we're starting to talk to nursing courses about, because we think that by integrating that into Myprogress, that will do some really valuable things. So I've just got a little screen capture here that I did of the system so far. I'll just skip forward a little bit. So what you can do is you can actually set up a framework. So here's a clinical skills framework with several different areas inside it. That's been set up for one of our institutions. It's their framework, and there's an admin tool that allows you to set that up. You can dig into one of these areas of the framework, and you can see all of the actual skills that make up that area, and then you can go through and you can use a rubric or a set of descriptors. They can be as long as you need them to actually rate a student against each of those areas. You can leave comments against those. The real difference between this and the way that forms in Myprogress work is that if you were doing this in Myprogress, then you'd then be submitting that to the system, and students would actually have to go back into the web system to check what they hadn't done yet. The way that this works is it's kind of one big assessment against the framework, which you can go back into at various different points in time. You can start to log bits that might come up one day, and then go back in the next day and say, well, I haven't done that yet, I need to do that. And you start to get a little colour-coded report which shows how you've done in each of those areas, and that can be customised if you just need very simple logging. So if you just need to say, I've done this or I haven't done this, you could use a red-green colour scheme or whatever it might be. The other thing that you can do The other thing that you can do in this tool is actually attach Myprogress assessments to bits of the framework. So if you've got a more complex form that relates to that framework element, something like, in that example, it was a service user evaluation, then you can actually run that as part of that framework and see completion built into that framework view. So that's just syncing, and then it takes you through some other bits, but I'll move on. Another area that we're exploring is integrations with other systems. We've been having conversations with InPlace. We know that that's a popular system with nursing schools, and we've been making good progress towards getting some plans together for an integration there. It's probably worth saying that there's lots of other work that we've already done around integrations. So in terms of single sign-on, that's something that we can quickly and easily set up. And we also have Moodle and Blackboard integrations. We're probably going to be revisiting some of those VLE integrations in the future to make them a bit richer in terms of the way that they work. And the final bit that I'm going to talk about is about actually visualizing progress. So we see this as something that's really, particularly because of the work that we've been doing with US universities, where making use of this big data that you're starting to collect to actually visualize what's going on is a real priority. We've been looking at some ideas for visualizing progress against frameworks. So what you can see here is some of our first thoughts about actually creating sign-offs against frameworks, and then visualizing the kind of breadth and depth of a student's progress against a framework. So here you can see all of the forms that a student's logged against these framework elements. You can see when they actually logged them, and they're also color-coded, so you can see if they've been done against a low complexity, a medium complexity, or a high complexity case. But that could be pulling through data from any question that's of interest to you. So it could be, is the student working unaided, or are they getting help from their mentor, or whatever it might be. And then similar reports could be used against whole groups of students. For that sort of group reporting, having much more visual dashboards is something that we want to do. So this is looking at evidence against frameworks, right across a group of students, where you can either dig into the particular competency, or you can dig into the students themselves, and you can see how far through the framework they are. Something that's of interest to a lot of schools is seeing which direction their students are being pulled. So if all of your students are doing fine against practicing effectively, but preserving safety is maybe something that they're not being signed off against so much, then that might be something, a trend to kind of watch out for. So some people like these kinds of visualizations. And then we've got the progress over time type of visualization, where you can start to see these are when these forms were logged throughout a whole student's career at university. So that's me, done. We're planning some more enhancements to my showcase as well.